There is a valley in the eastern Cape of South Africa where the Gamtus River runs clear and wide through hills that have stood since before any European eye had ever seen them. A Khoikhoi girl was born here around 1789. Her people called themselves the Gonakwasab. They were herders and hunters, people of the land, people of the river. Her birth name has been lost to history. The world would come to know her only by the name they gave her, Sarah Baartman. This is her story. And it deserves to be told with the dignity they spent her entire life denying her. Tragedy arrived early in her life. Her mother died when she was still an infant. Her father, a cattle driver, was killed when she was still young. After her parents were killed, she became enslaved at a farm near Cape Town.
She grew up doing what enslaved people under Dutch colonial rule were expected to do: domestic work. Invisible. Unremarkable to those who owned her. Essential to everything they built. She was not remarkable to them. Not yet. In Cape Town, a Dutch colonist murdered her partner, with whom she had had a baby who also died. With nothing left to hold her there, she entered domestic service. She had already survived more grief than most people encounter in a lifetime. She was barely 20 years old. In the early 1800s, Baartman was persuaded by an English surgeon named William Dunlop to go to England as part of a contract she signed, which is questionable because Baartman was illiterate. According to the contract, she would be entitled to a portion of her earnings and be allowed to return to South Africa after 5 years. It is widely believed that this contract was fabricated in response to a later court case, as Baartman was likely coerced and may never have signed any documents consenting to her display. Dunlop persisted and Baartman finally agreed, saying she would only go if Hendrik Caesars came too. She had conditions. Even then, she had conditions. Remember that. She arrived in England in 1810. She was approximately 21 years old. She had never left South Africa. She had never seen snow. She had never heard a crowd of thousands gather specifically to look at her. She was about 2. Baartman was first exhibited in London at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly Circus on November 24, 1810. Dunlop marketed her as a freak of nature, putting her on display wearing skin-tight, flesh-colored clothing, beads and feathers, while smoking a pipe. For 1 shilling, anyone was permitted to view her half-naked body. Those willing to pay a little more were permitted to touch her. She stood on a platform like an animal in a cage. And the people of London, educated, civilized, church-going people, paid money to point at her body and call it entertainment. According to historians Crace and Scully in their documented account, people came to see her because they saw her not as a person but as a pure example of a part of the natural world. She was a human being. Let that sit. Despite efforts by British abolitionists to secure her freedom, a court case failed to secure her release from her exhibitors. The African Association, a British abolitionist society, called for her release. Hendrik Caesars protested, responding, "Has she not as good a right to exhibit herself as an Irish giant or a dwarf?" Baartman was interviewed alone for 3 hours. She testified in favor of Dunlop, stating that she was not being restrained, had been working in London of her own free will, and had no desire to return to her family. Historians have long questioned what she truly said, and what she truly meant. She was illiterate. She was alone in a foreign country. She had no money, no passage home, no family to return to. What does consent mean for a woman with no options? Although the judge in the case believed Baartman had been coerced, he had no option but to dismiss the case. The law had failed her. And the publicity from the trial made her exhibition even more popular. She was taken on tours throughout England and by 1812, as far as Limerick, Ireland. 4 years. 4 years of being looked at. 4 years of crowds who purchased a ticket to stand close to her body and feel something they mistook for wonder. We do not know what she thought in those quiet moments. History did not record her inner life, only her body. That erasure is itself a kind of violence. In September 1814, after 4 years in Great Britain, Baartman was taken to France and sold to Israel, an exhibitor known for showcasing animals. Rayo displayed Baartman in various locations around Paris, frequently at the Palais Royal. She had been sold. Not metaphorically. Sold. Like the cattle her father once drove across the hills of the Eastern Cape. The naturalist Georges Cuvier, who had seen Baartman at one of Rayo's exhibitions, asked if she could be studied as a science specimen. From March 1815, Sarah was studied by French anatomists, zoologists and physiologists. These scientists, driven by prevailing racist theories, measured, sketched, and examined her body, particularly her genitalia, to supposedly prove biological differences justifying racial hierarchies. She refused to appear fully naked before them, arguing that this was beneath her dignity. She had never done this in one of her shows. Even then, even in that room, surrounded by men with power and instruments and the full force of European science behind them, she refused. She drew a line. They crossed it anyway, in their publications, in their conclusions, in the grotesque theories they built on her unwilling body. Cuvier believed that Baartman represented a transitional form between humans and apes, a racist idea that held sway among many European scientists. This wasn't merely misguided science. It was science actively deployed to confirm existing prejudices and reinforce a global order built on colonial domination. Sarah Baartman died on December 29, 1815 of an inflammatory ailment, possibly smallpox. She was 26 years old. 26 years old. She had spent 5 of them being exhibited across 2 countries. She had buried a partner and a child. She had stood in front of thousands of strangers who paid to reduce her to a body. And now she was gone. But they were not finished with her. Cuvier obtained her remains from the local police and made a plaster cast of her body before dissecting it. He preserved her skeleton and, in the name of science, pickled her brain and genitals and placed them into jars. Her skeleton, preserved genitalia and brain were placed on display at the Musée de l'Homme, the Museum of Man, in Paris. They put her in a jar. They put her in a glass case. They labeled her and charged admission and called it science. Her brain, skeleton and sexual organs remained on display in a Paris museum until 1974. 159 years after her death, she was still on display. From 1974 to 2002, her reconstructed skeleton and soft tissue remains were held in the storeroom of the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. Off display, but not returned. Never returned. Not yet. In 1994, upon the demand of representatives of the Khoikhoi group, South Africa's President Nelson Mandela formally requested the return of Sarah Baartman's remains from French President François Mitterrand. A free South Africa. A black president. And the first thing they asked for, one of the first things, was her. Bring her home. France said no. Not yet. Under French law, her remains had become part of the national heritage and could not be released. The French government was sympathetic, although it did not acknowledge wrongdoing for what had happened to her. Under French law, her remains had become part of the national heritage and could not be released. The stalemate was broken after a French legislator read a poem written by another Khoikhoi woman expressing her longing for Baartman's return. A poem did what 8 years of diplomatic negotiation could not. A woman's voice, writing to a woman who could no longer speak for herself, moved a parliament. On March 6, 2002, the French Parliament adopted a legislative act ordering the return of Sarah Baartman's remains to South Africa. Her remains were repatriated to her homeland, the Gamtus Valley, on May 6, 2002. A traditional Khoikhoi dressing ceremony was held on August 4, 2002. These ceremonies were seen not as an opportunity to mourn her death, but to celebrate her life and her image. On August 9, 2002, National Women's Day in South Africa, she was reburied on Vergadingskap, a hill outside the town of Hankey in the Eastern Cape. 192 years after she left. She came home. The burial site. Flowers. Her name carved in stone. The river visible in the valley below. The same hills she was born beneath. Sarah Baartman was a Khoikhoi woman born in a valley in the Eastern Cape. She was a daughter, a partner, a mother whose child did not survive. She was a human being with a name we almost lost entirely. She was taken to Europe with a promise written on a contract she could not read, exhibited in front of crowds who paid to see her body, studied by scientists who used her to justify the idea that black people were less than human, and displayed in a museum jar for 159 years after her death. And she still came home. The memorial marker at her burial site in Henke reads that the burial has brought closure to her life and restored dignity to her, her ancestors, and living descendants. Her Khoikhoi name was never recorded. But the Griqua people, whose emblem is a desert plant called Hottentot, which means cannot die, claimed her as their own.